the philosopher Empedocles considered that the cosmos is comprised of two forces. On the one hand, philia, and on the other hand, nikos. One of these processes, philia, which we will call love, is a gathering in together of aspects of the cosmos that have an affinity with each other. They have a sympathy for each other. They have a kind of resonance and are therefore gathered into a unity. Nikos, on the other hand, has to do with the idea of winnowing. This is when you trace the Greek word used by Empedocles back to its Proto-Indo-European root. We get the idea of winnowing uh, the wheat from the chaff, winnowing, scattering, um, putting out in a centrifugal sort of direction away from the center, winnowing. Um, and by contrast, gathering has to do with a bringing in towards the center. So we have a centripetal force in love and a centrifugal force in hate or strife, depending how you translate the idea from Empedocles. Love and hate, these are the two um, cosmic principles for Empedocles that govern the union and the dissolution of the four elements: fire, air, water, and earth. The words collect, neglect, lecture, and Lego, as in the toy, as in the stuff you play with, are all connected. In particular, the words collect, neglect, and lecture all have this lect aspect that they share, which goes back to a Proto-Indo-European root called leg. And I've mentioned this in a previous video on Owen Barfield's History in English Words. Leg. So the notion with leg is a very old word. It's a word that's supposed to be at the root of ancient Indian, ancient Sanskrit, ancient Persian, Old Irish, Old English, Latin, Greek. Proto-Indo-European is an old unity that precedes and is the ancestor to all of the diversity of those languages. And what this leg idea has to do with is, firstly, it underlies these words in the English language, as I mentioned: collect, neglect, lecture, Lego. It all has to do with gathering. Okay, that's the big idea I want to share in this video, is about gathering and scattering. So this Proto-Indo-European root has to do with gathering into a unity. It's worth mentioning at this point that the entire philosophical tradition of Platonism is predicated upon a metaphysics of unity. And another way of thinking about the notion of gathering is the drawing in of a multiplicity towards a unified center, and its opposite, scattering as a loss of unity, a return towards ungathered multiplicity or fragments. The most prominent, or at least the most systematic and articulated expression of Platonism in antiquity is, is the Neoplatonist Proclus in his Elements of Theology. And the first proposition which is considered in the Elements is the relationship between unity on the one hand and multiplicity on the other hand, or the manifold. This is basic to all logical schemes. For example, an Aristotelian logical scheme depends upon a tree of logic of genera and species. And what are genera and species but unities and multiplicities? The Neoplatonic and the Platonic tradition deeply informs um, the Aristotelian categories. I think there is a basic harmony there. Aristotle was, after all, uh, perhaps the most famous of Plato's students. Gathering, collecting. So think about this as a play activity with Lego. You're gathering something up. You're gathering the many bits up. You're taking a multiplicity and you're gathering it into a unity. That's what Lego is. That's what the play of Lego is. And Lego is is basically the same word with an O on the end as leg, this really, really old Proto-Indo-European term meaning gathering or collecting. One can consider that a house or a dwelling is a gathering. It's a gathering of materials into a unity to provide shelter for human beings. So is any settlement a gathering? It's a gathering of resources, of dwellings in a particular locale, a village, a town, a city. Any of these things, they depend upon unity. They depend upon gathering basically the bits up. You gather what Proclus says in a strictly technical term is that he says that any manifold must participate in a unity. Therefore, unity is primary and the manifold is secondary. This is the Platonic doctrine of methexis, or participation. Everything has to partake of a noetic unity. And so, yeah, as I mentioned, a town, a settlement, you could say the same about an atom, even the basic atomic structure, the indivisible structure. It became later. We found subatomic and quantum realms, but the notion of the atom is a gathering, a simple gathering. And the notion of the singularity in theoretical physics is a gathering of potential, an immensely dense gathering. So there are different forms of gathering. Um, the many different forms in society. One that I would like to talk about is the idea of the lecture, which is connected to collection, as I mentioned here. So just as we collect wood or we collect resources to build, let's say we collect wood to build a primitive dwelling in the wilderness, this is a leg, this is a gathering, very basic idea in language. And on Barfield's view, this is kind of it's a fossil of consciousness. It's a very basic um, and integrated meaning sort of condensed into this notion. And so you collect wood from the forest floor, or you collect berries for food, and you gather in. So the word, what I'm doing in this video, is gathering a manifold. So I'm taking something here, something here, something here, maybe a diff however many slides I have, however many multiple slides I have, however many minutes the video is chronologically. Um, there's various sort of data, you could say, and this data is unified. It participates in an idea, and that idea is the word or the logos of this video. In other words, for the speech to be coherent, the words must partake of a higher noetic unity. Therefore, lecture is connected to the idea of leg, gathering. It is simply a gathering, just a gathering of um, words, ideas, sources, topics, notions into a unity. And speech becomes incoherent when it fails to partake of that unity. In the same way that if I'm building a hut or a dwelling in the woods, then if the wood scatters off, if it breaks off in a storm, if it is sort of wrecked by a wild animal or something like this, it's being scattered. It's not gathered into the unity of the dwelling, and it may become really wet when it rains or exposed in some manner. So the wood is not participating in the higher unity. There is no methexis. But we should expect this on the these dual principles from Empedocles, you see, because there's always, we could say, a centrifugal force at work. You might call that the law of entropy in physics. That's a connection that comes to mind. But the tendency of things towards disorder. Um, there are forces that are like disorder in things. However, the mind or the soul of the human being is another gathering. It is a logos, and it partakes of the logos in its noetic mental function. Um, again, who are you? What is your identity? A gathering, a word, a logos, that might be experienced episodically or according to fragments here and there, and can exhibit greater or lesser degrees of fragmentation. But this is Jung's insight, of course, that the psyche is always looking for wholeness. It's always oriented towards its own inherent unity. Unity as a psychological principle, that is, that's Jung's thought. So language itself is a gathering, is my point. This very word leg we're exploring as a word is a gathering of meaning and notion. I guess meanings that the best I can say with that is that that's what a word is a gathering of meaning. In the same way that gathering wood for a dwelling is a kind of gathering of materials, so is a lecture or just a speech. And the word lecture being etymologically related directly to this idea of gathering. The um, This perspective sheds light on a basic point of Christian theology, which is the theology of the Logos. The logos is simply the Greek word, which means word. And hopefully, I've conveyed already a sense of what might be implied by this word. The logos, according to Greek philosophy, is a gathering, a noetic gathering, but shall we say, a great metaphysical one. It is the gathering of all things in creation into the unity of the Creator. All things, according to the Neoplatonic doctrine, proceed from the one unity and return to the one unity. You can see gatherings at many levels. You can see gatherings at the level of the earth, at the level of your body, at the level of a meal, food, resources like wood and building. As I've said already, material things can be gathered. So too can feelings be gathered at the level of water. As we move up from earth to water, feelings can be gathered into um, uh, aesthetic forms, um, resonances, into musical compositions. Feelings can be gathered, and thoughts at the level of air can be gathered, as we've been saying, into ideas, into bodies of knowledge. And the noetic gathering at the level of thought is basic to any metaphysical outlook on reality. Um, you see, because the other direction, if you reject unity, as Proclus convincingly states at the beginning of the Elements, is just non-unity. If you have multiplicity, you have an infinite regress to, because you just have multiplicity, you have no unity to gather it, then you basically have infinite nothingness in a sense. You don't have any level of unity of gathering. But if we admit the participation of the formless in form, then we have Platonic metaphysics in essence. Plato is taking the water and the river of Heraclitus, and this river of becoming partakes of the being, the absolute being of Parmenides. You see, Parmenides denied change, where Heraclitus said all that there is change. These are two different metaphysical perspectives, and Plato synthesizes these perspectives and shows the harmony between them. So we have this river of becoming, we have this constant change, this constant shifting of forms. And yet we have forms, images, archetypes, or ideas that continue to come back and back and back. These are more pervasive, these are more permanent, these are immutable, we could say. And this brings me on to, oh no, it doesn't. Okay, let me save that thought for the end then. Um, because I think it's the last slide. But like the just to wrap that is like basically you could think that there's a hierarchy of more unitive values and less unitive values. And if you thought that it was objectively the case that there is a scheme of value ranks, as the philosopher Max Scheler did, then you could say that there are gatherings, there are things that gather at a higher level, and there are things that divide. And to recognize this would be a kind of wisdom. Um, I've got a slide in here talking about the idea of neglect. So neglect means not just not gathering. So if something is neglected, it's not gathered into the logos or into the pattern of unity. Um, and therefore it is not patterned. It is not um, shaped or formed. And that's what the notion of neglect is. And we talked about scattering. In I am an avid chess player, and I've thought that this is in essence what chess is. It's gathering versus scattering. Uh, to gather your pieces, your forces, the manifold under your rule, and then to capture the unitive principle in your position, the king. And this scatters the forces because at checkmate, the entire force is scattered because there's no unitive principle anymore. The king has submitted. There is no uh, principled resistance at that point. And so that's the essence of chess is gathering versus scattering. The harmony and the unity and the affinity and the resonances between your pieces in a chess position are basically a gathering, a higher unity. You've unified the manifold at a high level, and this makes it difficult to be overcome, essentially. So, gathering and scattering. Um, this brings us to the final slide, which is a really not a particularly imaginative slide from me. Um, it's not really got anything on it, does it? So, but this is to talk about the hierarchy idea I introduced a moment ago, and to say that Max Scheler argues that there are four, let's keep it at four for simplicity, value ranks, which are um, the sensible or pleasure values, the vital or life values, the noetic or mind values, and the holy or religious values. And the top two of these value ranks are spiritual, essentially, in as much as they adhere or inhere in the person, like the person as a spiritual center, which is on Shayla's conception. And we have in the bottom two life values, values related to life. So pleasure relates to a feeling in the body, a localized feeling, which is good and valuable. But in order for it to be such, there must be a higher feeling in which it has its foundation. That is the vitality of life and the survival of life and the wakefulness of life and consciousness. Um, and so you have sensible values localized in the body, like pleasure and pain. And then you have life values like strength and weakness or vitality. Um, and these are life values. This is the third value rank. Um, and then you have noetic and religious values, as I mentioned. Now, the key point about this, a key point about it is that Shayla thinks that we feel these realities. We don't think them. Our heart feels them intuitively and intuits the objectivity of them through the feeling of preference. And he contends that the lower down you are on the scale, the more transient and the more extended the values are. So, for example, a piece of cake at the level of sense value is a piece of cake. It's extended, there's a slice, Or if you've got four people around, you then cut it in half and cut it in half again, and then you share it out. But if one person has a bigger value of cake than the other, then someone might think that's unfair, for example, in the division of material resources. They're divisive, essentially. Not necessarily, well, uh, valuable, valuable in their way, just not ultimately valuable, just relatively valuable, um, but inherently divisive, and therefore a ethos or a philosophical outlook based on material things will lead to division because of this axiological truth, this truth about value that Shayla notes. Then you get more integrated, you get more into the unity with the values of life, which pervade the whole of the body and concern the whole of life. And you get more united still with notions like justice, truth, and beauty, and even more so with God or divinity. The point with this is that the higher we get, the more united or unified the value sphere becomes. And also the more the greater the depth of satisfaction in feeling we experience, according to Shayla. So yes, we feel some gratification, some satisfaction from eating a slice of cake, and maybe more so eating the whole cake. But it's transient. We'll be hungry again, and it's very momentary, pleasurable. It's good. It's not to denigrate pleasure as such, but just to say that it has its place in the scheme of values. Um, a feeling of vitality, of health, of life, more abundant, is a higher value plane than eating cake, however good the cake is. And here we're getting more enduring values, deeper values, values that come closer to unity. But even so, as we reach higher into the noetic values, great work of art, for example, unifies culture. It transcends national interests. Beauty is beauty, and that is that. Beauty is a more unified and meaningful source of value that provides a deeper level of satisfaction in the heart, and as is truth. And here, Shayla comments that we are getting into values that are felt subspecie eternitatis, um, under the aspect of eternity. And we're coming into more unified and eternal value regions. This resonates deeply with Platonic metaphysics, as I've described. Proclus, for example, considers the one good unity, the one in which the whole manifold of creation participates. Although I don't know if Proclus would use the language of creation per se, but it's a different issue. The point is that there is an objective hierarchy of values, Shayla argues, which is intuited through feeling and is objective. There is an order to it, an order to the heart, an order to our affections, which ascends from the multiple and the divisible and the extended into unity and eternity. So that is, I'll leave it there. I think I didn't speak so much about Nikos, the idea of Empedocles about scattering or hate. Um, and I focused more on the idea of gathering. And I suppose that's because I think that love is more powerful than hate, and that there's an asymmetry between these principles. So I'm not sure that I'm advancing an Empedoclean view wholesale, although even that is, I mean, we only have really fragments of Empedocles, so it's not the easiest task to reconstruct his metaphysical outlook, let's say. But so I'm sort of playing with these ideas on the basis of reading fragments and broader a broader engagement with successive generations of philosophers, um, influenced without doubt by the pre-Socratics, such as Empedocles, Parmenides, and Heraclitus. Anyway, so the main idea was unity and gathering, the way that gatherings happen into intelligible or meaningful unities. This is a fact. I ask you or invite you to consult your experience concerning this. Just reflect upon how things hold together into unities. It's quite a strange thing. It's related, of course, to the basic metaphysical question as to why there is anything rather than nothing. You know, why does anything hold together into a unity as one? And so I wanted to connect that to some etymological insights, which I thought were interesting from the English language. Anyway, thank you so much for listening.